I need to sit like completely still every time I start this. Every time I start the stream, so that the picture, so the thumbnail that uses like the first couple seconds or whatever, ends up being a little bit cleaner. Now I just have this like blurry ass picture, but oh well, it can't be helped, I guess. Okay, we started late enough, so let's just get started, shall we? Had a little bit of a late start, just because like, well, the short of it is I had to wait for the bathroom, and someone was using it, and I was like, I really gotta go pee before we start, though. So that was the real reason why we started late. Anyways, hello and welcome to the streaming Parson reads the Book of Judges, and today we're going to be finishing up the Book of Judges because we actually managed to speed read through this one pretty quickly. The Book of Judges only has like 20 something chapters, right? 21 chapters, and I think we ended on the end of chapter 16, so that's probably like only 5 chapters left, and we'll probably read through these pretty quickly because I don't feel that like these ones have a lot of things to really talk about. And so I probably won't spend that long in each chapter. So we spend like what, 20 minutes, barely 20 minutes on each chapter, if even that long. Then we'll be done in like just over an hour. So that's kind of the plan for today. I'll be starting from Judges 17. So if you'd like to follow, just whip up a Bible on your desktop or whatever, your Bible app or something. I'll be starting from Judges 17. We'll be reading from the New International Version, or NIV. And yeah, we'll just dive right into it after a quick word of prayer. Lord God, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we have to read your word. And I just pray that as we read your word, you would show us your desire in our lives, and the call to repentance would be on our hearts today. I pray this in the name of your son Jesus. Amen. Alrighty. So just a short preface before we actually start. The last few chapters of the book of Judges kind of just pulls some like events, and most Bible scholars believe that like this was probably relatively close to when the book of Samuel begins, because the book of Judges kind of tells this time period about like about 200-300 years or so before the first king of Israel, which was Saul. And so the book of Judges kind of tells us time before that, and then there is actually a small book between Judges and Samuel, which is Judges and Samuel would happen one after another, but then there's the book of Ruth as well, which actually would have happened sometime during the book of Judges. While the Bible's not particularly clear, and I don't think the Bible really cared to tell us, most people have kind of just do some basic math to figure out when the book of Ruth would have happened, as the book of Ruth tells the story of basically King David's great grandfather being his great grandmother, basically, and how she met his great grandfather, and of course the birth of David's grandfather. That's kind of the big takeaway, if you will, which is kind of a weird way of looking at it. But the book of Ruth kind of just says this is the line of David and how it kind of starts, basically, or a big part of how it starts, if you will. I mean, obviously it goes further back, and you read in stuff like the book of Matthew, when it goes through the Davidic line, it goes even further back, right? But that's besides the point. But basically, when we talk about Judges in the book of Samuel, the last few chapters of Judges kind of leads up to the time basically right before Samuel begins. So that's kind of what you need to know. And then we're just kind of reading some events that happen, and the Bible's not overly meticulous about like when exactly it happened. But as I stated in like the first video of Judges, I talked about how like you have to treat the book of Judges as if it was kind of a compilement of all these like events that happened during that. Excuse me. Oh, first yawn of the stream. Kind of like these sets of events, and so it also has like the highlights of these events. So like obviously the book of Judges is not truly indicative of what was going on in Israel, but rather it was taking the extremes to kind of make a point about how ridiculous people are, right? And I know this is a hot take, but I mean we'll just say hot take of the week in the preface too. Um, it's not too different from the world today, right? You know, the way that one reason why so many people distrust the media, for example, is because like the media just takes extreme stories of like these really ridiculous cases, but whether it's like white on black violence or whatever, right? And it just takes like the extreme cases, and yeah, obviously there's violence against blacks or whatever, or you know, there was the Asian hate thing is apparently a big deal now, right? So an example of kind of how to view the book of Judges and how it's written, kind of take an example of like, okay, so there was that whole incident with the guy who, you know, he went and shot up these Chinese women in this massage place, right? I know this is like this news was like a month ago, the whole Asian hate thing. I know this whole thing happened about a month ago, but you know, I'll just use this as the illustration because it's the best one that comes to mind. Um, but you know, there was that whole thing, right, where the guy, you know, he went to this massage parlor and he shot up these Asian women, and you know, there was a whole campaign of like end Asian hate, and so, but at the same time, most people are more than well aware that like there's already a lot of discrimination against Asians, right, and it's not just by some, you know, crazy white guy, right, but you know, there's a lot of, you know, black against Asian racism and stuff like that. There's a lot of um, you know, Asian hating Asians, right? So, you know, Asian hate has been around since forever, but now people are making a big deal out of it, and it's now become like a social phenomenon, especially in like the media and social media. Even though like for the longest, like people know this kind of stuff has been happening for a while, right? No one's just really said anything, right? Um, there was this one movie I was just thinking of, which is like it's like an older movie, but it kind of portrays the same thing of like, you know, problems within like the Asian immigrant groups in like America. Although the show takes place in Vancouver, my home city, Vancouver, in Canada, but you know the idea is still the same. But what the point I'm getting at was that just because, you know, you look at the big headlines on in the media doesn't mean, you know, those are just the exaggerated cases, even though like we know there's been like a lot of problems already, right? I mean, that's why stuff like Black Lives Matter even exist, right? Or going back to the Asian hate um, example, right? Like we know this has been happening for a while, right? And my life is a good proof of that. I've been basically like stabbed, right? Because you know, no one would have looked. No, everybody makes a deal when the guard beats the shit out of somebody. No one blinks when, you know, a guy tries to stab the Asian guard, right? Because, you know, Asian guard, no one gives a shit about that, right? Whereas like, you know, if a security guard beats up a homeless guy, that's wrong. But when this, you know, a guy who needs free food so he can have more money for drugs stabs an Asian guard, no one cares, right? You know, I made this joke. I was like, "Hey, anything about me in the newspaper?" Right? Newspapers. Who even reads newspapers? But you get the point, right? Like, hey, was there anything on me? You know, when I got stabbed the other day? Nothing, right? Because nobody cares about that, right? And then so, but you know, the regular day-to-day things, of course, they still happen, right? But people tend to focus on like these more exaggerated um, headlines, like, you know, going back to the guy who shot up these Asian women, right? Even though like Asian people get like stabbed all the time, right? Because people hate Asian people running around doing everything, right? And taking all the jobs and stuff, right? Because Asian people do that. But no one bats an eye when all those things are happening, right? But then, you know, this one crazy white guy shoots up some girls, and all of a sudden it's all over the news, and it's the big like, we're starting a movement, you know, end Asian hate. It's like, why didn't anyone do this like long ago, right? And so the Book of Judges kind of does the exact same thing, right? Where it takes like, okay, the people of Israel, they were in idolatry, and it was leading to all these kind of bad things happening to the people of Israel. You know, a lot of women being mistreated. You know, a lot of unjust killing and stuff like that in the Book of Judges. And most of the time, people be like, yeah, whatever, right? Until like the Bible actually, or like they would have taken all these more serious cases, right? The big deals, right? And then people go, whoa, that's happening, even though like it's been happening for a while, right? And so that is kind of the perspective you need to take when you look at the Book of Judges. And so as we read these last 5 chapters, the reason why these 5 stories are going to be so ridiculous, you have to view it in the same way, right? It's like, it's not taking just the everyday, you know, crime and sin that Israel commits, but it takes like the worst of the worst, right? And so when you take the worst of the worst, and then you bunch them all together, and then you, like, I remember this old Russell Peters joke where like Russell Peters was talking about how like, you know, I wonder what they show like the Arab world of Americans and why people think America's so crazy. Probably all they show is like Jerry Springer, right? If all you show is like Jerry Springer, if you were to show someone who wasn't American, you know, a bunch of Jerry Springer clips and tell them this is what America is like, then yeah, of course we were gonna think like America's just batshit crazy, right? If all you showed them was Jerry Springer, and you know that was a pretty funny joke Russell Peters made back then, and it's so true, right? The Book of Judges is a great example of that, and you know it's like the Book of Judges is basically the Jerry Springer of ancient Israel, and that's how you should kind of look at these next few stories as we read through the end of the Book of Judges, because you know there's gonna be like, warning, we got some offensive material, but at the same time, you know, it's what happens when you take all the extreme cases. So anyway, that's enough rambling. Let's just get into reading. But I want you guys to keep this in mind as I read, and as you read along as well. So you kind of get an idea of what is going on in Judges and what Samuel, the prophet Samuel, is kind of making a point of as he finishes the book of Judges. Oh boy, that was a long preface, but I had to really, you know, talk about that because I have to explain a fair amount of things that when I watch my older streams, I did not explain as well as I should have. I've explained it to you now. So, there's your explanation. Chapter 17. Now there was this guy named Micah from the hill country of Ephraim, and he said to his mother, "The 1,100 shekels of silver that were taken from you, and about which I heard you utter a curse, I have that silver with me, and I took it." Then his mother said, "The Lord bless you, my son." When he returned the 1,100 shekels of silver to his mother, she said, "I solemnly consecrate my silver to the Lord for my son to make an image overlaid with silver, and I will give it back to you." So after he returned the silver to his mother, she took 200 shekels of silver and gave them to a silversmith, who used them to make an idol, and it was put in Micah's house. Now this man Micah had a shrine, and he made an ephod and some household gods, and installed one of his sons as his priest. In those days Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. Now a young Levite from Bethlehem in Judah, who had been living with the clan of Judah, left that town in search of some other place to stay. On his way, he came to Micah's house in the hill country of Ephraim. And Micah asked him, "Where are you from?" "I am a Levite from Bethlehem in Judah. I am looking for a place to stay." Then Micah said to him, "Live with me and be my father and priest, and I'll give you 10 shekels of silver a year, your clothes and your food." So the Levite agreed to live with him. The young man became like one of his sons to him. Then Micah installed the Levite, and the young man became his priest and lived in his house. And Micah said, "Now I know that the Lord will be good to me, since this Levite has become my priest." Chapter 17, pretty tame so far, right? Even though I just gave this whole thing about like how crazy the book of Judges ends up being. But chapter 17, the main point of it is to show how deep corruption runs in this pretty casual story, right? So you have this guy, pretty regular guy named Micah, right? And his mom has these like idols built for him, right? And so Micah has all these idols in his house, and then this young Levite shows up, right? Now, we don't know a lot about this Levite, but we can assume he's a pretty young guy. Probably looking for like, a place to do like priestly services. That's kind of what Levites do, right? And he's looking for a place, to do his priestly duties, right? And then this, the issue with this story and why, it looks pretty innocent on the surface, but the implication of it is actually a very problematic one. So on the surface, it seems pretty innocent because, like, okay, you have this guy, young priest, basically, and he's looking for a job, right? And who hires him? This guy named Micah, right? End of story. But you realize, the story put the setup of like, well, Micah has all these idols and worships all these gods, right? And then now we have this Levite who comes work for him, right? And the Levite becomes this priest. The priest of basically he becomes a priest of all these pagan gods, right? Because he works for Micah now, so that's what his job entails. But you gotta think about this deeply and think about the in between the line moments, which is what makes the story a little bit disturbing. So this young Levite is going around looking for a place to do his priestly duties, as a Levite is required to. But he can't find anywhere, right? So you're probably thinking, well, what's up with that, right? But what the story is telling here, that people just did whatever they want. And, the narrator says in verse 6, in those days Israel had no king and everyone did what they saw fit, right? Clearly what he's getting at is that people were not worshiping God, right? And so, people just worship whatever gods they wanted to. And now we've gotten to a point here where this Levite is now selling out to do priestly duties for pagan gods, right? And it looks pretty bad. It actually, when you think about it like that, you feel bad for the Levite, right? Because he has to sell out. Otherwise, he would just starve to death, basically, right? He has to sell out. But on the other hand, you look at how serious Israel, the state that Israel's gotten itself into, right? That it's so far in idolatry that, this priestly order that God wanted Israel to set up for itself has failed, right? It's basically a failed establishment. Now, another thing about this story that I also find kind of interesting, and part of this is more personal anecdotal, so take this with a grain of salt, and, judge me if you must, right? But I'm going to tell the story anyway, right? So, more often than not, I find myself doing kind of jobs that, like, it's very, it how do I put it? I don't want to say it's unsavory, because the jobs themselves, like, yeah, they kind of suck, but it's not so much that they're bad jobs, exactly, right? being a security guard isn't necessarily a bad thing. Well, I guess it depends on who you ask, I guess, right? Most people hate security guards, but being one, it's like, okay, you have to do it. But at the same time, I've actually run into trouble by taking up the security job. And the place where I run into the most trouble because I work in a security job is actually with churches. I've run into huge problems now with churches because I work as a security guard. And you think that's like, huh? Why would that be, right? That's kind of a weird thing to happen, right? You're trying to prevent people from stealing. Isn't that a good thing, right? Isn't that what good Christian people do, is not steal, right? And make sure other people don't steal, right? That's what you think. But if you thought that, you'd clearly be wrong, right? Because it was this funny thing where I was reading in the book of Timothy, and there's this whole thing where Paul tells Timothy, some requirements for his church leaders. Now, of course, when Paul is telling Timothy, there are certain contexts that need to be understood. And simple statements are not broad statements. So one of the things that Paul tells Timothy, and this is in 1 Timothy chapter 3, where he's giving this like basic description of what a pastor or a bishop, whatever, should be like. And one of the descriptions is that a bishop should not be a man of violence. Right? Apparently, I have disqualified myself from being a pastor, which is one reason why the streaming Parson channel exists, is because by that logic, I am not fit to be a pastor. Because I am a man of violence. I have to hurt people in my job. As a security guard, more often than not, you have to hurt people. Otherwise, you could be hurt yourself. I've been stabbed multiple times. So yeah, like I've busted people's faces in. I've broken people's bones. For all I know, I could have taken people's lives, right? By hurting them enough, right? I don't know. People could have died in the hospital or something like that after an injury I've caused somebody, right? It could have happened. I don't know that. But the fact that I have to do that now, the simple logic I may use, is I have to defend myself, right? If a guy sticks a knife at you, or the occasional case where I have been stabbed, what else are you gonna do, right? You're just gonna stand there and let the guy knife you over and over, right? Like, that's not how that works, right? I have a life to live, right? Of course, some people say, but you should lose your life in order to find it. Maybe, well, I don't think Jesus meant let someone stab you to death when he was saying to his disciples, lose your life. So some people have actually used that argument against me, which is kind of disturbing if you think about it. But, I've hurt people, right? I'm confessing on the internet. I've done serious bodily harm to people because I had to, right? But with that said, that's, now I'm in this state where I have to sell out, right? I do security work, and I do another job of basically I'm a bag boy for like this restaurant, right? Not restaurant. It's like a food service, and I'm a bag boy for it. So basically, what the service does is that they cook these meals for these people who like buy these meals online, right? And then before they deliver them, we have to obviously organize them and bag them and send them to the right customers, right? And so that's what I do. I'm the bag boy, and I help with like the packaging before they get delivered and stuff like that. And I do these jobs, and who are the kind of people I hang out with? I don't hang out with Christians very much anymore, right? More often than not. And yeah, I've sold out, right? Some pastor I am, right? Is probably what you're thinking. Some pastor I turned out to be, right? I hurt people for a living. I hang out with interesting characters, right? And of course, like, if you guys follow my channel, you also know that I hang around these other guys on YouTube, and these guys are, colorful characters, right? Not the most savory of people, but at the same time, it's like, wow, it's the people I hang out with now. Now, I could sit here and try and justify myself of why, I don't hang around Christians as much as I should, and I hang out with all these other colorful characters, and I can try and justify myself by saying like, well, it's part of my evangelism platform or whatever, right? And I can try and justify myself, but at the end of the day, in a lot of ways, I am more than big enough to own up that, like, yeah, I'm a bit of a sellout, right? I'm not this, proper priestly person, right? I'm not, and I never will be from the looks of it. But when you live in a culture that has sold itself out, including, I hate to say it, but even in a lot of church culture, so many have strayed away from God. What else can, some parson like myself do, right? We have to sell out, right? And it's depressing. It is, right? But it also is the way it is, right? Now, at the end of the day, I just have confidence that, you know, my my faith in Christ and trusting that Christ has some plan in the shithole that is my life. God, that Jesus does have some plan for it. That's what I have to hope in, right? Because otherwise, what hope would there be? But at the same time, I'm more than big enough to admit that, like, yeah, I'm a sellout, right? And I have to hang around unsavory persons, right? But that's just this is what happens though when even the church communities allow themselves to collapse. This is what happens, and you read in Judges 17. This is exactly what happens, right? And this Levite, he ends up doing something wrong in the story, but on the other hand, you have to feel bad for this guy, right? Now, even though the main character, a lot of people focus on Micah and him building these idols and stuff like that, and he's a bad guy because he doesn't worship God, right? But if you really look at chapter 17, the story is actually about how sad it is for the Levites and how far Israel has turned away from God that the Levite has to sell himself out to an unsavory character like Micah. And it's an interesting thing to really think about. And I think it's something a lot of um, people in the ministry work today need to think about. And why does this happen? And how have we allowed this to happen too? Right? It's a very solemn story, but I think it's one that it's often overlooked because it's a short story. It's only like this one chapter that's like what 13 verses. So, but at the same time, it's a story that when I was reading it, preparing for the week, I gave it some thought. I was like, man, I'm like, I totally get where this Levi's at. This Levite, sorry, where this Levite's at, right? I totally get it. And I'm pretty sure there are a lot of other young pastors like myself that feel the same way, And if you haven't heard from any, I, if you are out there, I hope that this will be some word of solace to you that you keep being faithful. It is not you that has failed God, right? Because you haven't. And even when you have to sell out, it's not really on you, right? And at least you shouldn't feel guilty that it's on you. Because more than not, it's actually a bunch of other things that have failed you, right? But of course, that's all the more reason we need to trust in Christ more, right? That Christ has a bigger plan in all this, right? That is what we have to hope for. And that's really the only thing we can hope for, especially with everything going on these days. Anyway, let's move on to chapter 18. Judges chapter 18. So in those days, there's a theme going on here. Israel had no king. And in those days, the tribe of the Danites was seeking a place of their own where they might settle, because they had not yet come into an inheritance among the tribes of Israel. So the Danites sent 5 of their leading men from Zorah and Eshtal Eshtal? Eshtal. I think that's how you say it. Eshtal. To spy out the land and explore it. Now these mans represented all the Danites, and they told them, go and explore the land. Hang on, just... So they entered the hill country of Ephraim, and came to the house of Micah, where they spent the night. When they were near Micah's house, they recognized the voice of the young Levite. So they turned in there and asked him, who brought you here? And what are you doing in this place? Why are you here? They said to him, oh sorry, I skipped a verse there. Verse 4. The Levite told them what Micah had done for him and said, he has hired me, and I am his priest. Then they said to him, please inquire of God to learn whether our journey will be successful. So the priest answered them, go in peace. Your journey has the Lord's approval. So the 5 men left and came to Laish, where they saw that people were living in safety, like the Sidonians, at peace and secure. And since their land lacked nothing, they were prosperous. Also, they lived a long way from the Sidonians and had no relationship with anyone else. When they returned to Zorah and Eshtal, their fellow Danites asked, how did you find things? And they answered, come on now, let's attack them. We have seen the land and it's very good. Aren't you going to do something? Don't hesitate. Go there and take it over. When you get there, you will find an unsuspecting people and a spacious land that God has put into your hands. A land that lacks nothing whatsoever. Then 600 men of the Danites, armed for battle, set out from Zorah and Eshtal. And on their way they set up camp near Kiriath Jearim in Judah. This is why the place west of Kiriath Jearim is called Mahanedan. Mahanedan, or Dan. It's kind of one of those weird, like, you're supposed to, we pronounce it Dan, but I'm too used to calling it Don. To this day. Verse 13. From there they went on to the hill country of Ephraim and came to Micah's house. Then the 5 men who had spied out the land of Laish said to their fellow Danites, do you know that one of these houses has an ephod, some household gods, and an image overlaid with silver? Now you know what to do. So they turned in there and went to the house of the young Levite at Micah's place and greeted him. The 600 Danites, armed for battle, stood at the entrance of the gate. The 5 men who spied out the land and went inside and took the idol, the ephod and the household gods, while the priest and the 600 armed men stood at the entrance of the gate. When the 5 men went into Micah's house and took the idol, the ephod, and the household gods, the priest said to them, what are you doing? And they answered him, be quiet, don't say a word. Come with us and be our father and priest. Isn't it better that you serve a tribe and clan in Israel as priests rather than just one man's household? The priest was very pleased. He took the ephod, the household gods, and the idol, and went along with the people, putting their little children, their livestock, and their possessions in front of them, and they turned away and left. And when they had gone some distance from Micah's house, the men who lived near Micah were called together and overtook the Danites. And as they shouted to them, the Danites turned and said to Micah, what's the matter with you that you call out your men to fight? And he replied, you took the gods I made, and my priest, and went away. What else do I have? How can you ask what's the matter with you? The Danites answered, don't argue with us, or some of the men may get angry and attack you, and you and your family will lose their lives. So the Danites went their way, And Micah, seeing that they were too strong for him, turned around and went back home. Then they took what Micah had made and his priests and went to Laish against a people at peace and secure. They attacked him with the sword. And they attacked him with the sword and burned down their city. There was no one to rescue them because they lived a long way from Sidon and had no relationship with anyone else. The city was in a valley near Beth Rahab. The Danites rebuilt the city and settled there, and they named it Dan after their ancestor, who was born in Israel, or who was born to Israel. Though the city used to be called Laish, there the Danites set up for themselves the idol, and Jonathan, son of Gershom, son of Moses, and his sons were priests for the tribe of Dan until the time of the captivity of the land. Then they continued to use the idol Micah had made all the time the house of God was in Shiloh. Okay, so basically chapter 18 kind of tells the story of like one of the tribes of Israel and just doing conquest things because you gotta do conquest things. And so they encounter the Levite, the sellout basically. And they're like, yo, there's this place. And we want to know if like we have God's favor to take it. And the Levite's like, okay, let me pray about it. And then, he gets an answer of like, yeah, it's positive. So yeah, you can go take this city. And then of course the Danites convince him like, yo, why don't you just come with us instead? Like instead of just working for this guy, right? Why just be the priest of one guy when you can serve all of us? And the was like, sure, I guess, right? I mean, I should be doing stuff for my own people. And so he leaves and he goes with them, and of course Micah tries to like get his stuff back because they stole like his household gods and everything. Which is funny because like is like you think that after receiving the blessing from the priest and knowing that like okay we have God's favor, they still end up taking someone else's gods, right? And of course this will end up being a snare for Israel, or not Israel entirely, but the Danites here, right? And this will end up being a snare for them. And so it's just one of those things where like there's this kind of domino effect, right? It all starts out with like a sellout just wants to do what he's been brought up to do his whole life, be a Levite. Because we'll later see like more corruption in these, same people, right? And of course, this even though the story just tells like the small Dan tribe, right? This is easily applicable and easily observed in like culture at large, right? And on the one hand, yeah, like it's easy to point the finger and be like, oh, these younger pastors, like they're a bunch of sellouts, they're a bunch of, idiots that don't know how to hold on to the old way of doing things and doing what's right. But on the other hand, it's like, well, what grounds have you given to them, right? You've basically screwed them over left and right. What are they supposed to do, right? And it's not easy for all these the story uses the Levite as this like representative, right, of the modern younger Christian that's kind of stuck in like, okay, do we honor the ways that like our parents have done things, or do we try and blend in with culture? And there's no right answer and there's no good answer, which is the thing that really sucks about it, right? That's the reason why I don't, that's why we run into as much trouble as we do, because there is no good way around it. You can't really, there's no good way of doing it, right? You're kind of screwed if you do, you're screwed if you don't, right? So You just kind of have to, I don't know, you just gotta take it, right? And it's so easy to like judge when Israel was running into this problem, but at the same time, we're kind of not too much better now, right? Like, sure, the only thing that we do have is like, well, for those young sellouts, you just gotta keep trusting in Jesus. That's all I can tell you, right? Because otherwise, you know, you're more screwed than the ancient Israelites, and these young Levites have to sell out, right? But of course, what the Bible is pointing out here is that because these young um, Levites have to sell out, it's so easy for corruption to just like poison the people, right? And so when it talks about like this young Levite and he takes with him like the household gods and stuff, and you know it's going to be a snare for Israel. You already know that, but I mean that the corruption happens in those small things, right? But that is what happens when the older generation doesn't uphold doing what's right, and then doesn't, and by extension, they don't leave anything for the next generation, right? Because then the next generation is kind of just like, well, what do we do, right? Um, and winging it is not a good answer, but that's exactly what they do, right? And that was true in the Book of Judges, and unfortunately, that's still true now, right? And I was thinking about like some of these like controversies and these events that have happened with like I've mentioned this in like past videos with the Book of Judges because it's relevant, but like you know um, stuff that happened to like various church leaders or whatever, right? Big Christian names and all this stuff that's been coming out, controversial things. Some of these guys being like really bad people, and other not so good things are coming out about them and all that stuff. And I mean, you get that impression from the people of the past and the young people. It leaves a stigma, right? And so the next generation of church leaders are like, well, what do we do, right? We don't want to get caught up in the scandals like the older generation did, but at the same time, we have to be wary not to cave into, you know, the godlessness of a lot of modern culture now, right? So what do, right? Because clearly selling out isn't gonna work. You can't just wing it, right? And so it's a tough thing. And once again, I say this solemnly, but like I totally get it, right? I totally get it. And there are other young pastors out there that are like, what do I do, right? And what can you do? Um, you know, this is I hope to be able to like lend some comforting, you know, words and you know be someone you can talk to, because that's one reason why the streaming Parson exists, right? But at the same time, and I get the struggle. I get the fact that this is a really difficult uphill battle, and now we're stuck with the repercussions of it, right? But I mean, on the other hand, all I can say is like, well, I just keep hoping that God has some kind of plan, you know, for the shitholes that are our lives, right? Because yeah, it's pretty clear that things are not going very well right now. But we just got to keep hoping. We just got to keep trusting in Jesus, right? And you know, trust in His faithfulness that He's given to us in His Word, right? But as we read through the book of Judges, I think it's a very important thing for us to reflect on like the reality of how insane things can get, right? You know the old saying, it's always darkest before dawn, right? But sometimes being in the pitch black is pretty damn scary. But that's also why we must, bear one another's burdens and comfort one another, right? And to try and be there for one another, because facing that darkness is there's a bit of comfort when you have someone with you. All right, chapter 19. Oh, here's a good one. Oh yeah, now we're talking crazy talk now. Oh yeah, chapter 19. So in those days, Israel had no king. Now a Levite who lived in a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim took a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. There's already a lot of questions there. But she was unfaithful to him. She left him and went back to her parents' home in Bethlehem. After she had been there for 4 months, her husband went to her to persuade her to return. He had with him his servants and 2 donkeys. She took him into her parents' home, and when her father saw him, he gladly welcomed him. His father-in-law, the woman's father, prevailed on him to stay, so he remained with him for 3 days, eating, drinking, and sleeping there. On the 4th day they got up early, and as he prepared to leave, the Levite, the woman's father said to him, "Refresh yourself and go get something to eat. Then you can go." So the 2 of them sat down to eat and drink together. And afterward the woman's father said, "Please stay tonight and enjoy yourself." And when the man got up to go, his father-in-law persuaded him, so he stayed there that night. On the morning of the 5th day, when he rose to go, the woman's father said, "Refresh yourself and wait until the afternoon." So the 2 of them ate together. Then when the man, with his concubine and his servant, got up to leave, his father-in-law, the woman's father, said, "Now look, it's almost evening. Spend the night here, and the day is nearly over. Stay and enjoy yourself. Early tomorrow morning you can get up and be on your way." But unwilling to stay another night, the man left and went toward Jebus, that is Jerusalem, with his 2 saddled donkeys and his concubine. Now when they were near Jebus, and the day was almost gone, the servant said to his master, "Come, let's stop at this city of the Jebusites and spend the night." His master replied, "No, we won't go into the city, whose people are not Israelites. We will go on to Gibeah, there's no L, to Gibeah." And then he added, "Come, let's try to reach Gibeah or Ramah and spend the night in one of those places." So they went on, and the sun set near Gibeah in Benjamin, and there they stopped to spend the night. They went and sat in the city square, but no one took them in for the night. That evening, an old man from the hill country of Ephraim, who was living in Gibeah, the inhabitants of the place were Benjamites, came in from his work in the fields. When he looked and saw the traveler in the city square, the old man asked, "Where are you going, and where did you come from?" The Levite answered, "We are on our way from Bethlehem in Judah to a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim where I live. I have been to Bethlehem in Judah, and now I am going to the house of the Lord. No one has taken me in for the night. We have both straw and fodder for our donkeys, and bread and wine for ourselves, your servants. Me, the woman, and the young man with us. We do not need anything." "You are welcome to stay in my house," the old man said. "Let me supply you whatever you need. Only don't spend the night in the square." So he took him into his house and fed his donkeys, and after they had washed their feet, they had something to eat and to drink. And while they were enjoying themselves, some of the wicked men of the city surrounded the house, pounding on the door. They, they shouted to the old man who owned the house, "Bring out the man who came to your house so we can have sex with him." And the owner of the house went outside and said to them, "No, my friends, don't be so vile. Since this man is my guest, don't do this outrageous thing. Look, here is my virgin daughter and his concubine," right, referring to the Levite. "I will bring them out to you now, and you can use them and do whatever you please." Real dad of the year right here. "But as for this man, don't do such an outrageous thing." But the men would not listen to him. So the man took his concubine and sent her outside to them, and they raped her and abused her throughout the night, and at dawn they let her go. At daybreak, the woman went back to the house where her master was staying, fell down at the door, and lay there until daylight. When her master got up in the morning and opened the door of the house and stepped out to continue on his way, there lay his concubine, fallen in the doorway of the house, with her hands on the threshold. He said to her, "Get up, let's go." But there was no answer. And the man put her on his donkey and set out for home. When he reached home, he took a knife and cut up his concubine, limb by limb, into 12 parts, and sent them all areas of Israel. Everyone who saw it was saying to one another, "Such a thing has never been seen or done, not since the day that the Israelites came out of Egypt. Just imagine, we must do something. Someone speak up." So chapter 19, one of the more messed up stories in the book of Judges. So the TLDR was that there was this guy, and I guess he had a concubine. I mean, where's this guy's wife? A concubine implies that he already had a wife. So you already got first problem right there, right? And then, of course, clearly this guy is a bit of a procrastinator, right? Because, he's staying with his in-laws, and they keep, like, convincing him to... I mean, part of it is, like, it's not just... Like, it's more than one person's fault here, right? Like, the in-laws are, I don't know, putting off, like, sending them home. And who knows what for. And then, of course, the Levite himself, he doesn't just, like, stick to his guns and be like, "No, we're leaving on the third day," right? And so, I mean, it's sort of, like, both parties' faults. But anyway, the guy eventually, like, "All right, we're leaving." And it only gets worse, right? Because then this guy, he refuses to stay in the towns of, like, the non-Israelites. But then, he keeps going to Gilead, a place that was a Benjamite town. Just a bit of trivia knowledge, I guess, is that the bulk of Jews today would be quote-unquote Benjamites. Just a little bit of trivia. Most people are either from the people of Judah or the people of Benjamin. The other tribes of Israel are quote-unquote lost tribes. But for all we know, they could just be assimilated to, like, the other Israelite groups. And, that's why most Jews don't care anymore. Because they're probably like, well, we're probably just all assimilated now. But anyway, besides the point. So the town of Gilead is supposed to be a town of all Benjamites, right? And the interesting thing is that, like, the Levite first thinks that, like, well, I'm not going to stop in these like foreigner towns, right? Because they're not Israelite, so clearly they're they're not good places to stay. But of course, the turn of the story is that, like, well, no, right? Um, the Israelites themselves, in this case, the Benjamites in this town, they're already so far from God, right? And so this story has like a lot of familiar vibes. And I mentioned this way back when I talked about like how Genesis is a book of prophecy and actually predicts stuff in like other books of the Bible. And in a way, like, yeah, there's a historical element to Genesis, but it was more Genesis's real purpose was to tell the Israelites how to, like, what the world was like, right? And the reality of how the world, how do I put it? The reality of which a world without obedience to God would be like, right? What would it be like? Think of it like this. The book of Genesis is a story, it was the series of stories Moses told the Israelites to basically give them the hypothetical question of what would it be like? Just imagine what it would be like when we stop obeying God, right? And it used like all these characters like Abraham and Isaac and earlier characters like Cain and Abel and all of them, right? And what would it be like if we stay turned away from God's law and stuff like that? Well, we get a lot of those answers in other parts of the Bible, and the book of Judges has a good example right here. We have a couple other ones that I went over when we were doing the first part of Judges, but we get another clear example here, and there's actually a very close parallel with this story in chapter 19, and of course the Sodom and Gomorrah story. Of course, the big difference here is that, the less magical elements, the more magical elements don't occur in Judges, right? Because in the book of Judges, we treat it as if like it was like, how do I put this? The book of Genesis is the more fantastical world that predates ours, right? Whereas the book of Judges, you could easily say the book of Judges could have happened, 1000 BC, or the book of Judges could be happening in 2021, right? Because the book of Judges is a reflection. It's a dark mirror, really, of modern people, right? People in general, and of course, the old saying goes, as much as things change, things stay the same. And the book of Judges is a dark mirror of that reality, that human beings are really wicked, right? And we have a very wicked nature. And so chapter 19 in Judges retells the Sodom and Gomorrah story, but it's not as fantastical, right? God doesn't just obliterate the place, right? Because it behaves, this Gilead, or sorry, Gibeah. Why do I keep saying Gilead? Gibeah is, could be like New York City. It could be Vancouver. It could be anywhere, right? Like, Gibeah is a very real place, right? Sodom and Gomorrah kind of exists on this more like abstractal, hyper reality, but Gibeah would be equated to like a real place. Like anywhere could be just like Gibeah, right? And of course, the Bible has to do the whole like crazy headline thing, and takes like the worst, right? So it's like the worst guys, right? And we have to tell a story about the worst people in Gibeah, right? We can't just pick any regular bad people. We got to pick like the worst people, right? And so we have all the wicked men in town who want to gang rape a guy, right? Which is already pretty messed up. And then, of course, dad of the year here, just like Lot. And so this old man in the story and Lot are basically the same guy. He says the same idiotic things, right? Here's my virgin daughter, you know, just take her, but don't like touch my guest, right? And then, you know, the the Levite is kind of like, he's kind of apathetic, which really is disturbing too, right? Because this is supposed to be a Levite, right? and he's pretty apathetic to everything that's going on. So he just gives these guys, right? His concubine, the woman that he decided to travel across the country, more or less, to pick up his concubine when she had left home, right? Which begs the question: why did she even leave him in the first place? Maybe what the Bible doesn't tell us is that this guy actually is kind of a scumbag. And I mean, I know it sounds distasteful to do this, but we've had our recent controversies of church leaders that have been total scumbags, right? And so these there's clearly a parallel with, like, this Levite and some of these modern church leaders that have fallen from high positions, right? And guys that are actual scumbags. And so this Levite in the story decides, like, oh, he just give these awful guys his concubine, the woman that he decided to make sure she stayed at home, right? And then of course the story goes all graphic and is like, oh yeah, like, then these guys had their way with her, because what else do awful men do, right? Abuse women. So um but I mean, this kind of apathetic Levite is what you get when people don't live obeying God and being faithful and confident in God, right? This what guys like this guy are what happen, right? When there's a lack of, like, the presence of God, if you will, and not just like on a personal level, but on a societal level, right? And hot take, but that's kind of in the world we live in now, right? And it's one of those things where, like, it's a chicken or egg thing, right? The chicken or egg thing is kind of like, okay, so society likes to, you know, point out all these bad church leaders or whatever, but at the same time, it is those same people who create such people, right? Because those are the people that hate good people, right? Once again, like, it's like all we've fallen in as a society to be like, we only care about the Jerry Springer drama kind of thing, right? As opposed to creating good, authentic people. We don't we like to make the talk of, like, oh, being authentic, being real, you know, that's our virtue. But really we don't care about that as much as a society. That's actually, like, like, society generally frowns upon that, despite the fact that, like, oh, we believe in these things, but they actually don't. Um, and so society would create even church leaders that are like these apathetic and kind of awful people. And so it's a chicken or egg thing, right? Because society points at all the bad things in people, but then at the same time, not only do they allow it, but their distaste for good people creates bad people, right? And so you're kind of not in a good place here, right? That's just like a continual downward spiral into mayhem and more violence, right? But we look at the story in chapter 19, and it's just like, yeah, that's the, this terrible event happens, and no one does anything, right? Because nobody wants to do anything, right? Like, and see, I hate doing this again because, like, oh, we're like etching into political realms again, but, like, you think of, like, stuff like Black Lives Matter, Asian hate, or whatever, right? You think about those kind of things, and people are like, well, why doesn't it change? Why is there all this violence against black communities or whatever? Let's just use BML as a good example. Why is there all this violence in black communities? But at the same time, those people who make those complaints do nothing to, like, well, why don't we improve black communities, right? Instead of trying to improve a lot of black communities, instead it's just like, well, let's just say everyone else is terrible, right? it's everyone else's fault that they're in this state, as opposed to saying, why don't we make you better, right? Instead of saying like, why don't we make you better, we've delved into this like, well, let's just point out what's wrong with everyone else and tell them to stop doing what's wrong. But if you can't just go around telling people to stop doing bad things without telling them, well, how do you stop doing bad things, right? Why don't you can't make people stop doing bad things if you don't give them good things to do, if that makes sense, right? You you need to generate good things for people to do in order for them to stop doing bad things, right? And so that's kind of, you look at Judges 19 and it kind of has that kind of parallel with the world today, right? You know, it's so easy for the people to like get outraged about like a woman getting cut up, right? Because this guy got so dissatisfied with his concubine who was, gang raped, and that was his own fault for not doing anything, right? Similar to the whole Adam not fighting for Eve when the serpent tempted her, right? Not exactly a one-to-one parallel, but you can kind of see the similarities there, right? The man does nothing, right? So, we look at this world today, well, why are there all these bad men around? And, you can watch all those fun YouTube videos of women complain about shitty men, and they have every right to. But at the same time, you also, like, oh, there's all these bad men around. Well, why don't you let good men be good men? Why don't we actually make bad men stop being bad men, right? How about that? Instead of just saying, like, this blanket statement of, like, well, then all men are trash, right? Which is the easy way to go, but it doesn't help, right? Because then if you start going around parroting that, like, oh, all men are trash, then you give less reason for men to do good things, right? And then if there's less reason to do good things, you get more bad men, right? That's kind of how that works. And so, you look in Judges 19, and the story continues with a guy like he then cuts up his concubine. He like slices her to pieces, and that obviously takes basically he's beyond psychotic at that point. I mean, to be willing to do that to another human being, clearly you're not all there, right? You're pretty screwed up in the head if you're willing to cut up another human being like that. You think of the comic book characters like the Joker who does stuff like that. Yeah, they're psychotic and they're evil. That's exactly why they're evil, right? Because they do stuff like that, right? No value for human life. And so this Levite is kind of the same, right? And at the end of the story is interesting because the people, when they see this woman's like her pieces, if you will, spread out, kind of, and the news gets across that this woman got mutilated by her, husband. And they're like, well, why? What? This has never been done in Israel. Why doesn't anyone do anything? But it's like God has tried this so many. Like the implication in Judges is that God had tried it with you, and you refuse. So if you're gonna refuse, God telling you how to do good things, well, no one is gonna care if you have suggestions of how to do good things, right? Which is, you think of why like we need that moral standard in God, right? The moral standard there, because then it is a a bar that anyone can follow to be a good person, right? Anyone can do it. Doesn't matter if you're, your ethnicity, your age, or whatever, right? Anyone can do it, right? That was the whole point of when God was setting up morality. And of course, another thing to account for when you're reading the book of Judges is obviously, unlike Genesis, this is well after, Moses had the law written out for the Israelites. He spelled it out for them, right? And of course, you read the book of Judges, and of course, there's other factors as well that like once stuff like this started becoming more problematic and more rampant, because once again, you have to treat you have to treat Judges 19 as if it was like a major media headline story, but it's just an example of an ongoing problem, right? And so, people doing nothing about all these bad men, right? And of course, what the Bible does that's ironic is that, the Levite, being a little bit racist, decides he's not going to stay in these other towns, and he wants to go to a Jewish town because he trusts it, right? Enough. He thinks he can trust other Jews or other Israelites, but clearly he's wrong, right? Because wickedness and sinful nature is something in all people, right? And it can consume anyone, and has consumed a lot of people. And these wicked men in town that want to gang rape a guy settle for gang raping a woman. The fact that rape even goes across their mind already tells you a lot about them. That these guys are pretty awful. And so what the Bible's getting at here is that this is what happens, though, right? When we ignore God, because then we have no litmus, we have no bar, for what is good and how to tell people how to do what's good, right? If you don't tell people how to do what's good, then all people are going to do is just bad things, right? They're just going to commit evil, because that's what you get when you don't tell people how to be good, right? So you get everybody doing evil, right? And of course, I'm join the whole Christian rabble, right? Of like, yeah, this is what happens in a godless society, and this is where we've gone to as a society, right? We've ignored God's commands as a society, and because of that, we don't know how to do what's good, and therefore all we do is evil. And then now, of course, we also live in an era that's, well, I wouldn't say it's worse. It's just differently done, if you will. But not only is, we've ignored doing what's good because, we ignore God's laws, but we also try to say that those evil things are the new good, as opposed to turning to God and doing what's good, right? We're just going to say, well, no, evil is good, right? And then if that's the case, then, but of course, what we can't ignore is that deep down, the image of God thing, you know, there's a natural resistance to that, right? Some of us have common sense to desire a more moral construct. And of course, one of the problems is that once we have ignored God, we try to build that ourselves, and it doesn't quite hold up enough, right? Because once again, we need someone who is good, i.e., God. And this is one of the whole reasons why the Bible states over and over that God is good. Because God is good, then his words and his statutes are good, right? Because God is good. As opposed to, like, we know that men are shit, so you cannot create good things from the awful, right? And this is one of the meanings Jesus has when he talks about, like, good tree produces good fruit, bad tree cannot produce good fruit, a bad tree can only produce bad fruit, right? And so this is what would happen. But the book of Judges is basically saying, well, this is what is happening, excuse me, because we've ignored what is good, right? And so all these people, saying like, oh, this evil has been done. Why doesn't it, like, someone speak up, someone do something? But it's like, do what, right? You've turned away from God, so what do you expect to be done, right? And once again, like, similar to like the headlines thing, and I use like the Asian hate headline as an example when I preface this. It's the same kind of thing where, like, when this guy, right, this crazy white guy, that's what we're gonna refer to him as. I don't care to look up his name. Um, when he was trying to, like, justify himself of, like, why he did what he did, and despite of how stupid it was, because once again it's just idiocy, right? But his level of stupidity doesn't just happen overnight, right? His idiotic racist ideas stem from, like, a long system of just, well, we ignore what's good, right? We ignore God, right? And so by ignoring God, you have no standards, right? And so when that happens for, generations, then you get people like that, right? You get that kind of thinking, and people just normalize it, right? And that's why we view him as such a bad person, right? Because he just normalized that kind of thinking, where a lot of us would be like, no, that's pretty appalling that you think that. But at the same time, more often than not, you actually find a lot of people who think exactly the same way. The only difference is they haven't actually gone and shot up Asian women, right? But they think the same way. I've dealt with people who think that, right? And, of course, the villain of the story is the guy who throws the punch, not the guy who thinks evil things, right? But maybe that I need a little bit more temperance, right? Maybe I should be more tolerant of people's bigoted ideas, instead of throwing my fist all the time every time I find something appalling. But jokes aside, this is what happens though, right? And Judges 19, this appalling story, is meant to really poke at that's a big problem in how we think as people, right? And how we've allowed our society to allow us to think this way. Food for thought. Alright, so chapter 20. We're going to be done this pretty soon, actually. I'm only been streaming for an hour and 20 minutes. But we only have 2 chapters left. We're going to be done this pretty quickly. Then we could do some housekeeping and then end the stream. Chapter 20. Then all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, and from the land of Gilead, come together as one, and assembled before the Lord in Mizpah. The leaders of all the people of the tribes of Israel took their places in the assembly of God's people. 400,000 armed men. The Benjamites heard that the Israelites had gone up to Mizpah. Then the Israelites said, "Tell us how this awful thing happened." So the Levite, the husband of the murdered woman, said, "I and my concubine came to Gibeah in Benjamin to spend the night. During the night, the men of Gibeah came after me and surrounded my house, intending to kill me. They raped my concubine, and then she died. I took my concubine and cut her into pieces, and sent 1 piece to each region of Israel's inheritance, because they committed this lewd and outrageous act in Israel. Now all you Israelites speak up and tell me what you have decided to do." All the men rose up together as one, saying, "None of us will go home. No, not one of us will return to his house. But now this is what we will do to Gibeah. We'll go up against it in order decided by casting lots. We'll take 10 men out of every 100 from all the tribes of Israel, and 100 from 1,000, and 1,000 from 10,000, to get any provision for the army. Then when the army arrives in Gibeah, in Benjamin, it can give them what they deserve for this outrageous act in Israel." So all the Israelites got together and united as one against the city. The tribes of Israel sent messengers throughout the tribe of Benjamin, saying, "What about this awful crime that was committed among you? Now turn those wicked men of Gibeah over to us, so that we may put them to death and purge the evil from Israel." But the Benjamites would not listen to their fellow Israelites. From their towns they came together at Gibeah to fight against the Israelites. At once the Benjamites mobilized 26,000 swordsmen from their towns, in addition to 700 able young men from those living in Gibeah. Among all these soldiers there were 700 select troops who were left-handed, each of whom could sling a stone at a hare and not miss. Israel, apart from Benjamin, mustered 400,000 swordsmen, all of them fit for battle. The Israelites went up to Bethel and inquired of God. And they said, "Who of us is to go up first to fight against the Benjamites?" The Lord replied, Judah should go first. The next morning, the Israelites got up and pitched camp near Gibeah. The Israelites went out to fight the Benjamites and took up battle positions against them at Gibeah. The Benjamites came out of Gibeah and cut down 22,000 Israelites on the battlefield that day, so about half of them. Something like that. No, never mind. 400,000, never mind. Forgot to carry a zero. So about like 5% of them. But the Israelites encouraged one another and again took up their position where they had stationed themselves the first day. The Israelites went up and wept before the Lord until evening, and they inquired of the Lord, and they said, "Shall we go up again to fight against the Benjamites, our fellow Israelites?" The Lord answered, "Go up against them." Then the Israelites drew near to Benjamin the second day. This time, when the Benjamites came out from Gibeah to oppose them, they cut down another 18,000, all of them armed with swords. Then all the Israelites, the whole army, went up to Bethel, and there they sat weeping before the Lord. They fasted that day until evening, and presented burnt offerings and fellowship offerings to the Lord. And the Israelites inquired of the Lord. In those days the Ark of the Covenant was there, with Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, ministering before it. So the Israelites asked, "Shall we go up again to fight against the Benjamites, our fellow Israelites, or not?" And the Lord responded, "Go, for tomorrow I will give them into your hands." Then Israel set up an ambush around Gibeah, and they went up against the Benjamites on the third day, and took up positions against Gibeah as they had done before. The Benjamites came out to meet them, and were drawn away from the city. They began to inflict casualties on the Israelites as before. Excuse me. Well, second yawn of the stream. So about 30 men fell in the open field on the roads, the one leading to Bethel and the other to Gibeah. While the Benjamites were saying, "Ha! We are defeating them as before," the Israelites were saying, "Let's retreat and draw them away from the city to the roads." And all the men of Israel moved from their places and took up positions at Baal Tamar. And the Israelites ambushed, charged out of its place on the west. Then 10,000 of Israel's able young men made a frontal attack on Gibeah. The fighting was so heavy that the Benjamites did not realize how near disaster was. The Lord defeated Benjamin before Israel, and on that day the Israelites struck down 25,000 Benjamites, all armed with swords. Then the Benjamites saw that they were beaten. Now the men of Israel had given way before Benjamin, because they relied on the ambush they had set near Gibeah. Those who had been in ambush made a sudden dash into Gibeah, spread out and put the whole city to the sword. The Israelites had arranged with the ambush that they should send up a great cloud of smoke from the city, and then the Israelites would counterattack. The Benjamites had begun to inflict casualties on the Israelites, about 30, and they said, "We are defeating them as in the first battle." But when the column of smoke began to rise from the city, the Benjamites saw the whole city going up in smoke. Then the Israelites counterattacked, and the Benjamites were terrified, because they realized the disaster had come upon them. So they fled before the Israelites in the direction of the wilderness, but they could not escape the battle. And the Israelites who came out from the towns cut them down there. They surrounded the Benjamites, chased them, and easily overran them in the vicinity of Gibeah on the east. 18,000 Benjamites fell, all of them valiant fighters. As they turned and fled toward the wilderness, third yawn of the stream. Verse 45. As they turned and fled toward the wilderness to the rock of Rimmon, the Israelites cut down 5,000 men along the roads. They kept pressing after the Benjamites as far as Gidom and struck down 2,000 more. On that day, 25,000 Benjamite swordmen fell, all of them valiant fighters. But 600 of them turned and fled into the wilderness to the rock of Rimmon, where they stayed for months. The men of Israel went back to Benjamin and put all the towns to the sword, including the animals and everything else they found. And all the towns they came across, they set on fire. So there's such a thing as taking things a little bit too far. That's what the Israelites did to the Benjamites. Because yes, the Benjamites created a great crime. But at the same time, it doesn't just mean you get to kill everybody, right? But, you know, where chapter 19 was a more like where an individual, disobeys God and doesn't, listen to God's statutes, from the small to the big. Here in chapter 20, it goes back from big to the small, right? So now it's a whole society of people that just like, no, we're just going to commit like vengeance ourselves. And even though, yeah, they like ask God and God's like, all right, fine, like do what you have to. They were pretty unrelenting and needlessly so, right? But at the same time, it's one of those things that it's a tough thing to think about, because on the one hand, like the people of Israel wanted to purge the evil, right? But at the same time, they end up committing evil themselves, because you're already so blind to, God's laws and His statutes and God's compassion. You're so blind to it that when you think you're doing God's work, you end up just committing other atrocities, which unfortunately has been a pattern, throughout history, and other, groups have done it. People are quick to point out stuff like the Crusades did that, right? Which is, once again, this is exactly what happens when we don't look to God to teach us what is good, right? But instead think we can enact justice for ourselves. But of course, this is all the reason why, like in various parts of the Bible, God will tell, the reader that it is Him who does justice and will bring vengeance. Because if man is left to do it on his own accord, man will just go all out and he'll kill whatever, right? The kill every last one of them, which is exactly what the Israelites did to the Benjamites, basically. An interesting observation to make here too, and once again the parallels with Genesis, or rather the anti-parallel, is that like, Benjamin was the favorite of Israel, right? The person, right? Like the kid Benjamin, and Israel the person, or Jacob. And this made the lives of, the other sons kind of miserable, right? Because they already lost Joseph, and now Benjamin became the new favorite. And so the other brothers, they always had to be subservient to Benjamin. And yeah, they looked heroic when Joseph was going to kidnap Benjamin. And then the other brothers were like, no, take us instead, right? No, don't take Benjamin. But here now, when people have forgotten that history and forgotten how to be good, like their ancestors, right? They just commit all kind of atrocities to the smallest tribe, right? At the time, anyway. Because ironically, Benjamin ends up being the biggest tribe, and now the bulk of Jews today are Benjamites. At least that's the old study anyway. Supposedly that's where they all, all the Jews nowadays are Benjamites, supposedly. Well, Benjamites and Judites, or people of Judah. Of course, the reason for that was because during, the book of Kings and the Chronicles, the other tribes basically get wiped out. So there weren't a lot of anyone else left. Go figure. But of course, that's another lesson of what happens when you stop obeying God. You're going to get wiped out. And that's what happened to most of the other tribes. And God was a little bit merciful to the tribe of Judah because, he wanted to use the tribe of Judah to bring Christ, but that's its own thing altogether. And let's not detract. We're still in Judges, right? But in chapter 20 of Judges, you see like the other tribes showing like this envy, right? And this hatred toward, this smaller clan, the Benjamite clan, right? Not too dissimilar from, the kind of envy that could have built up between, the other sons of Israel or Jacob and, of course, Benjamin, right? Benjamin being the favorite after Joseph was sold to slavery. So this is an interesting parallel that happens here. The rest of the story is pretty straightforward. It just kind of gives this battle kind of story, right? And of course, this being like a news, major media hit, right? The story is oddly specific on the numbers because it's like saying like, this is what happened. It's giving you like all the details, right, of this like event, right? Of course, this is where a lot of people tend to think that like, well, maybe the Bible is fictitious, and people think that because of how like selective and detailed, or let me put it this way, how detailed the selective parts are, right? But the Occam's razor would just be that like, well, just like today, we pay attention to the big headlines, right? The stories that hit the media and the ones that the media really runs with, right? As opposed to like the everyday story, right? No one cares about those, right? You think of like, even on YouTube, you see these kind of like case in point, right? When there's a scandal among a big YouTuber, people, pay attention. But no one cares about, all the small channels. Like, who are we, right? We're just a bunch of nobodies. So if stuff happened to us, nobody would care, right? But with a bigger YouTuber, that's different, right? It's not that different, like, from the Book of Judges in that sense. All these bigger events, of course people would pay attention, right? Because, of course, there are other ramifications too, right? Of how it could affect, like, the future, if you will. So, using, like, YouTube as an example, right? If there was a big problem, if there were, like, a lot of controversy, like, a lot of big channels. Or I'll use a better example, just because, people were talking about it, like, last month. I know I'm an old man, so I'm always a little bit behind the trends, but when there was, like, the whole Smash Brothers community, like, scandals, a lot of these, like, pro Smash players being, like, child predators. And so, like, no one cares about, like, the average Smash player, right? And the smaller channels that play Smash, no one cares about them, right? But when all these, bigger Smash community people, and all of them turn out to be, like, scumbags and child predators, yeah, it really did a number on the Smash community, right? It really did a number on it. But, of course, like, that's why you have to pay attention to, all the bigger communities. Or all the figureheads in a community, right? And it was no different here in the Book of Judges, and why the Book of Judges is as selective as it is when it tells the story in the end of Judges, right? And particularly Judges 20, right? And why these big headlines kind of are a big deal, because they will decide things in the future, right? Which we'll get to that when I cover the next book, which I will mention. Well, you can kind of guess which one I'm going to do next. But, next week I'll start, the next Bible book, and you'll kind of see, you know, why people thought what they thought then. And when you have the book of Judges to spring off, you're like, yeah, yeah, totally justified, right? Like, totally get it. But this is, it's interesting that chapter 20, as we move toward the end of the book of Judges, kind of ends this way, right? Because it really sets up, you know, how Israel was to move forward, how the people of Israel were to move forward, right? And how to try and create their new identity after such calamity, right? Anyway, let's finish off the book of Judges. Chapter 21. Wives for the Benjamites. I don't know why I read the Bible's heading here that I have in this version. So, chapter 21. So the men of Israel had taken an oath at Mizpah. None of us will give his daughter in marriage to a Benjamite. The people went to Bethel, where they sat before God until evening, raising their voices and weeping bitterly. Lord God of Israel, they cried, why has this happened to Israel? Why should one tribe be missing from Israel today? And early the next day, the people built an altar and presented burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then the Israelites asked, who from all the tribes of Israel has failed to assemble before the Lord? For they had taken a solemn oath that anyone who failed to assemble before the Lord at Mizpah was to be put to death. Now the Israelites grieved for the tribe of Benjamin, their fellow Israelites. Today, one tribe is cut from Israel. How can we provide wives for those who are left, since we have taken an oath by the Lord not to give them any of our daughters in marriage? Hasty oaths, remember that. Then they asked, which one of the tribes of Israel failed to assemble before the Lord at Mizpah? They discovered that no one from Jabesh Gilead had come to the camp for the assembly. For when they counted the people, they found that none of the people of Jabesh Gilead were there. So they sent 12,000 fighting men with instructions to go to Jabesh Gilead and put to sword those living there, including the women and children. This is what you are to do, they said. Kill every male and every woman who is not a virgin. Well, at least specific. How would you know that? They found among the people living in Jabesh Gilead 400 young women who had never known a man. And they took them to the camp at Shiloh in Canaan. Then the whole assembly sent an offer of peace to the Benjamites at the rock of Rimmon. So the Benjamites returned at that time and were given the women of Jabesh Gilead who had been spared. But there were not enough for all of them. Clearly, no one seemed to have learned anything. The people grieved for Benjamin because the Lord had made a gap in the tribes of Israel. And the elders of the assembly said, with the women of Benjamin destroyed, how shall we provide wives for the men who are left? The Benjamite survivors must have heirs, they said, so that a tribe of Israel will not be completely wiped out. We can't give them our daughters as wives, since we Israelites have taken an oath. Cursed be anyone who gives a wife to a Benjamite. But look, there is an annual festival of the Lord in Shiloh, which lies north of Bethel, east of the road that goes from Bethel to Shechem, and south of Lebanon. So they instructed the Benjamites, saying, go and hide in the vineyards, and watch. When the young women of Shiloh come out to join in the dancing, rush from the vineyards, and each of you seize one of them to be your wife. Then return to the land of Benjamin. When their fathers or brothers complain to us, we will say to them, do us the favor of helping them, because we did not get wives for them during the war. you will not be guilty of breaking your oath because you did not give your daughters to them. So that is what the Benjamites did. And while the young women were dancing, each man caught one and carried her off to be his wife. Then they returned to their inheritance and rebuilt the towns and settled in them. At that time, the Israelites left the place and went to their tribes and clans, each to his own inheritance. And in those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. That ends the book of Judges. So chapter 21 is a short but pretty messed up story. So we just read in chapter 19 that the Benjamites were pretty wicked guys. At least there were a lot of wicked men among them, right? And that is what sparked this whole fight, right? You know, a small crowd of really bad guys, you know, incites the ire of the whole nation, basically. And then, you know, this is one of those clear examples of not thinking things through. So you beat up you kill most of the Benjamites, and you leave some of them alive. And then you're like, well, crap. They're gonna go extinct if we don't like get wives for them. So basically, they tell these guys to do the very thing that caused the whole problem to start with, right? Okay, Benjamites, you're gonna go and seize these women, right? And just take them as your wives, however that works, right? I'm being coy there, but you know, take a wife, right? And just snatch one. You know, we already know that these guys are capable of doing that because they kind of did that to another guy's wife. So yeah, not good, right? But this is just a clear example of, ow, what happens, my cat is here, when you don't think things through. And on the one hand, there's like a lot of nepotism where, you know, the Israelites are like, well, these are our countrymen. We shouldn't just let them all die. But on the other hand, it's like, well, you're the exact reason why they're dying in the first place. I guess you didn't think that one through, huh? Right? But then to continue, you know, the downward spiral, if you will, it's like they just let these guys like take advantage of these women, right? And disregarded these women. Of course, you know, this was also one of the problems of the past, right? Where women were not viewed the same as men. This is one of the problems what happens, right? One of the correct reasons why things like feminism exist, right? Is because, you know, for just like back then and for a long time, women were treated as second-class citizens. And when you have that kind of idiotic thinking, you know, it leads to stuff like this, right? But once again, this is what happens when you disregard God, right? When God's call for compassion and God's call for being good, right? And to be just. When you ignore those things, you get situations like this. And, you know, there's an interesting thing that I'm going to say it's Samuel who wrote this. And there's a certain reason why. Well, I kind of mentioned this when I first talked about the book of Judges. And there's another very clear implication once we get to the next book, which I might as well announce it now. If it goes without, it should be obvious that starting next week, I will start reading from the book of Samuel. A great one to read. I think the book of Samuel will be a lot more fun than Judges was, that's for sure. But, you know, there's a certain theme that ties Judges with the book of Samuel. And of course, as you know, Samuel is kind of stating here in Judges, and he states it a couple of times, you know, this is a time when Israel had no king. And people just did whatever they wanted, right? And if you can guess, one of the big connection, if you will, then good on you if you can guess it beforehand. It's not like it's a trick question. But then again, there's a lot of Christians who don't know, so what do I know, right? But one of the interesting things is that, like, this is what chaos looks like. This is what happens when you don't have order. You don't have, when people just do whatever they want, right? And the interesting thing is, the world today is not that different, right? A lot of people just think they can just do whatever they want. And people will claim that it's like, no, it's my personal freedom, right? I can do whatever I want. But of course, the reality is, and I've mentioned this in this Exodus study, you're not free if you think you can just do whatever you want. Clearly, you read in the Judges, clearly these people were not free, right? When they just did whatever they wanted. It just led to mayhem. It led to, bad things. I mean, if you really want to argue that that is freedom, that people can just do that, then, I don't know if that's a hill you want to die on, right? Considering what the free people doing whatever they wanted were doing, yeah, not a hill you want to die on. At least it's not one I want to die on, right? So, but this is what happens when you abandon God's statutes, right? And his commandment of how to build a better society, right? And how to make good people, which is what God was trying to do when he gave the 10 Commandments, right? Was to give a basic foundation for how people can be good, right? Which is, to be like him, right? To how to for us as God's children to be more like our Father, if you will. We become good people. That's kind of the idea that God was giving in Exodus. And clearly, when people just do whatever they want, as we see in the book of Judges, clearly that is not how you get good people, right? If people just do whatever they want. But of course, Judges is meant to be like the antithesis, if you will, to Exodus, right? Which is exactly what Genesis prophesied. And so, when I did these first 3 series on Genesis, Exodus, and Judges, you kind of see that poetry, right? Of course, if you wanted to be really hypothetical, I should have read Exodus first, then go back to Genesis, and then read Judges. But I'm kind of just going in how, like, in order, if you will, as opposed to more thematic, right? But you kind of see that poetry there, right? Where, Exodus, when God starts giving the laws, he kind of is giving the guidelines of, like, this is how, you connect closer to me. That's kind of what God is trying to suggest. This is how you connect closer to me. And by doing so, you become good, right? Genesis prophesies, what happens when we don't do that, right? Even as early as the Eden story, right? When Adam and Eve disobeyed God, then they, the beginning of the downward spiral, and it only gets worse, right? Of course, there's some ups too, right? As God makes a plan of how he's going to save his people as they fall into sin. But of course, you get to the book of Judges and you have the antithesis of Exodus, which was ignoring God's statutes of how to be good and thinking you can just do whatever you want. And of course, when you just do whatever you want, that only creates bad people, right? I remember reading this one thing. It was like an article. It was talking about how, like, a lot of like some modern comic book writers are talking about how, like, well, villains are more fun to write, right? Because they can just do whatever they want, right? And people relate to that. But it's like, that's not a good thing. That's not a good thing, you know that, right? Like, why do you think for the longest time people have always liked, and to an extreme have worshipped hero myth, right? The hero's journey, right? And how those older stories were so they were so loved throughout history, right? Was because people wanted to aspire to be good. But now we've kind of gone like the book of Judges direction, where we feel like, no, we want to quote unquote be free. And that means we do whatever we want, even if it's bad, right? Even the most evil things. But hey, I'm free to do that. That's kind of the mindset our society has adopted, and that's why, you know, I was reading this article about, people that like villains a lot more, and you definitely see this in like a lot of movies as well, where like the villains are much more sympathetic, even empathetic, and the hero's like a foreigner, right? And so, um, I'm watching The Boys. You ever heard of that show? It's also a comic book as well. And The Boys is basically like a world where, imagine if the so-called heroes were actually all really bad people, right? But and of course, the funny thing about when you watch The Boys, right? Um, the guys who fight against them, the crap, Butcher is the main character. Butcher, he's a vigilante basically, and he tries to he fights against the superheroes, but the superheroes are actually all really bad people, right? They kind of just do whatever they want, and Butcher's all like, "This has got to stop," right? We live in tyranny because these guys just do whatever they want, right? But of course, when the beauty of using like a superhero narrative, when you kind of paint that, is that like the power dynamic is much more apparent, right? Which is the reason why The Boys is, an interesting story to read. I think it is something that people should actually check out. Of course, it is like pretty violent, so you know, um, take my rating with a grain of salt. Like I like the story; it's pretty good. But once again, one, my opinion is probably not valid for a lot of people, and secondly, um, I mean, it is just my opinion. And secondly, I have a strange taste in things, but what I appreciate about reading The Boys and watching the show is that like it really shows, like the kind of evil that happens when people just do whatever they want, right? And of course, you know, contrary to like old, comic, like DC, for example, which obviously The Boys is a parody of. After all, the metas in The Boys is basically the Justice League, right? And so obviously it's like a complete it's a it's a it's a parody. It's a complete satire, and it does it in a very good way, right? Where the reason why, like, old school Justice League was so loved was because you have all these people, these great heroes, that have gone through the hero's journey, right? And that's what makes them heroes. But when you have people who just do whatever they want, you know, who do as they saw fit, right? Just like in The Boys, you get tyranny, you get bad people, you get people who abuse power. And the beauty of using a superhero narrative is that the power dynamic is very clear, right? Because I mean, what would happen if the evil people who just did whatever they wanted had superpowers, and normal people like us couldn't challenge them, right? Then you get absolute tyranny, right? And so, which is all the reason why Butcher fights against him, even though he's kind of a douchebag himself. He's not a really good guy, like, but of course he's more like, because he's a jerk, right? Like he's a big jerk, but at the same time, he's the good guy of the story, right? And so, but that's also because he stands by some basic moral code, even though like it's a little loose because if you watch the show, you learn he's pretty traumatized too. He's not a paragon of virtue by no means, but at least he understands that freedom is not, just do whatever you want, right? And so he fights to try and put an end to it, but of course that's kind of tough when you're fighting an evil version of the Justice League, right? But the book, going back to the Book of Judges and my closing notes for it, that's it's one of those things that like the book of Judges is like what, the 7th book in the Bible out of like 66, if you're wondering how many there are. I'm not going to read all of them, relax. I already skipped 3 of them. Or 2 of them, sorry. No, I skipped 3 of them, yeah. Well, I can't count. I skipped 3 of them. And so, you get to the book of Judges, and you see that, like, within, like, the first 7 books of the Bible, this kind of, like, setting the scene of, like, God had a plan, and he wanted the world to be good. But we, in our sinful ways, decided to just do whatever we wanted, which is, the original sin, really. And that just led to all kinds of, all kinds of bad things, right? Tyranny, evil, broken relationships, and whatever else, right? When we think we just do whatever we want. And the book of Judges kind of, really puts this, like, emphasis on, like, this is what the world looks like when people just do whatever they want. And clearly, it's not a very good one. But as we will see as we move forward, starting next week, I'll be reading the book of Samuel. God starts taking a lot more proactive. I mean, he already did that in Exodus, but he's going to take other much more proactive steps in how to bring goodness to the world. But more importantly, where is goodness? What is goodness? Right? And so God has to bring us back to the basics, if you will. And that's kind of one of the beauties of reading the book of Samuel, is that you get to see that, and how God says, like, this is how you understand what goodness is, right? And what real freedom and goodness are. So that's kind of the direction, God takes the Israelites. Anyway, excuse me. That's the end of the book of Judges. We made it. I know I managed to speed through this book pretty quickly. But that's because, like, last week I read for, excuse me, I have hiccups now. Last week I read it for like 3 hours. That's why we went through it pretty quick. And the book of Judges is not that long. It's not like Exodus. Exodus wasn't that long either. Exodus only feels long because you have to go through all the law stuff. And then, like, Genesis was pretty long. Book of Samuel is going to be pretty long, though. And when I talk about the book of Samuel, like, I refer to 1st and 2nd as one book. More on that when next week. So definitely tune in next Friday for starting the book of Samuel. But with that being said, we got some housekeeping to do. So, as you know, I've already finished Bravely Default 2 on this channel. And I've decided I'm going to take a little bit of a break from Switch games and maybe play something on PC for the next streams. Whether I start on Monday or not, we'll see. I'm thinking about it. But I still need to really solidify what I want to do. Because, of course, one of the problems is that, like, if I stream a game, a PC game, most people would quickly, like, I need to find a niche within what I do, if that makes sense, right? Because, obviously, like, if you want to watch a person with more skill play, there's a lot of people with more skill than I do. After all, I'm just some old guy, right? Who's not the best at games. Why lie about it? But to try to find a niche of what I do, right? But with that said, though, we'll find something to do on Monday. And even if I don't have a new game exactly to play, I'll probably do like a one-off or something. So, since it's still early April, we'll be starting a quote-unquote new season of stuff. So Monday, we'll see what I end up streaming on Monday, but I will start to do game streams again, because I know I had to stop doing that for a while because I ran into like copyright claim stuff with like Bravely Default, which was just annoying. But hopefully I don't run into that problem with the next game I play, because people stream these games as well, right? If you like most PC games, normally you don't have a problem because, I mean, other people stream them. So I'm not streaming like an obscure title. I'll probably just stream something that like other people play it too. So um, there's that. And then, of course, on top of that, you know, I've already started a throwback Thursday series. I started it last week, so 2 episodes are up. You can definitely check that out if you know go to the channel, and they're in my. You look at my recent videos or whatever, right? I got a couple throwback Thursday videos, so definitely check those out. So the schedule for next week looks something like Monday streaming something, either something new or a one shot if I don't have um, a new game to really stream yet. But I do want to stream it as opposed to just doing like a upload premiere like I did with the rest of Bravely Default. So there's that. That's Monday, and Wednesday I'll also be doing that. Thursday, continuing Throwback Thursday. Throwback Thursday, Heroes of Might and Magic 2 will be continuing on Thursday. Part 3 will be this coming Thursday. And then, of course, next Friday I will be starting with reading the Book of Samuel. So I hope you guys will come for that one, because that one is a lot more fun to read. I really enjoy reading the Book of Samuel. So anyway, that's it for announcements. With that being said, this is going to be the end of the stream. If you guys enjoyed this little journey through the Book of Judges with me, you guys learned something, that's fundamentally what I hope to achieve by doing these with you guys. And yeah, I will see you guys next week starting on Monday. Hope you guys have a great weekend, and God bless you.